I always thought that happiness in marriage was like the shoreline of an ocean. Waves of emotions rolling in and out, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy, but always present. Lately, however, the tides in my life had receded, leaving behind a barren, dry sand where intimacy and connection once flourished. My husband, always the industrious provider, had become a ghost in our home. His presence was a whisper, a fleeting shadow cast by the harsh glow of his laptop screen. Conversations had dwindled to logistical exchanges, groceries, bills, appointments, stripped of warmth or curiosity. I found myself filling the silence with the hum of household chores, the clinking of dishes, the white noise of a life maintained but not truly lived. It wasn't as if I didn't love him. Love, I believed, was a choice as much as it was a feeling, and I had chosen him over and over again through the years. But love without desire, without attention, was like a garden left untended. I craved the small affirmations, the touch of a hand in passing, a lingering gaze that spoke more than words. Instead, my days had become a series of routines, my nights a quiet echo of what intimacy used to be. He was always busy, his work a convenient shield against the complexities of our marriage. I told myself he was doing it for us, for our future, but the truth lay somewhere in the void between us, a truth neither of us wanted to confront. Then there was him, the son of my best friend. He had recently moved back to the neighborhood after finishing his studies, a young man with an easy smile and a presence that filled the room. He would often come by to help with small tasks around the house, a favor to his mother and, by extension, to me. At first, I saw him as an extension of those childhood days when he and my own children would run through the yard, carefree and sun-soaked. But time had sculpted him differently. He was no longer the boy who tracked mud through my kitchen, but a man who stood on the threshold of his own life, full of promise and unspoken stories. It started innocently enough. A shared laugh while organizing the attic, the brush of his hand against mine as he passed me a box of old photographs. I felt a jolt, a tiny electric spark that I quickly extinguished with a practiced smile. He didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he did and chose not to acknowledge it. There was a kindness in his eyes, a softness that my world had long since lost. He listened, not just out of politeness but with a genuine interest that made me feel seen. When he spoke, it was with a lightness that contrasted sharply with the weight of my own days. His stories were fresh, colored with the excitement of youth and the quiet rebellion of someone who had yet to be worn down by life's demands. One evening, after helping me fix a broken cabinet door, he lingered a little longer than usual. We sat on the porch, the air thick with the scent of approaching rain. He spoke about his dreams, his fears, the uncertainty of standing at the edge of adulthood. I listened, offering the kind of advice that felt both maternal and something else, something I couldn't quite define. As the sky darkened, he leaned forward, our shoulders almost touching. His proximity was both a comfort and a warning, a line drawn in sand waiting for the tide to wash it away. I thought about my husband, the distance between us growing not only emotionally but physically. His absence had become a constant, a quiet resignation that hung between us. He had recently suggested a business trip, a getaway with colleagues that didn't include me. It wasn't the first time and I doubted it would be the last. I had nodded, offering my usual support, but inside the ache of loneliness deepened. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I found myself replaying the evening's conversation. His words, his laughter, the way his eyes lingered on mine just a second too long. I knew it was dangerous, this line of thought, but I couldn't help it. It was the first time in a long while that I had felt more than just a shadow of myself. I wanted to hold on to that feeling, to let it fill the empty spaces inside me. I knew where it could lead, the sharp edge of temptation glinting in the dim light of my thoughts. But for now it was just a quiet longing, a whisper in the dark. The days after that evening on the porch stretched and twisted, each moment pulling me further into a quiet chaos. I moved through my routines like an actor on a stage, each chore a line in a script I had long since memorized. My husband remained a constant absence, physically there but emotionally out of reach. He had left for his business trip with a quick kiss on the cheek and a promise to call, but days passed with only brief, impersonal messages. Meeting ran late. Hope your day was good. I responded with equal brevity, my words as hollow as the space between us. I told myself that this was normal, that all marriages went through phases of detachment and silence. But the truth gnawed at me. It wasn't just the lack of communication. It was the absence of everything that had once made us a couple. The small gestures, the stolen moments, the unspoken understanding. All of it had faded, replaced by a partnership that felt more like cohabitation than love. I began to wonder if he felt the same, if he too lay awake at night questioning where we had gone wrong. Or perhaps he didn't think of it at all. Perhaps for him this was simply life as it should be. In his absence, the visits from my friend's son became a balm for my restless mind. He was a gust of fresh air in a house that had grown stagnant. He seemed to know when I needed company, showing up with a bag of groceries or offering to help with small repairs. His presence was never imposing. Instead, it was a quiet reminder that I was not invisible. He asked about my day, my thoughts, my dreams, questions that no one had asked me in a long time. His attention was intoxicating, and I found myself looking forward to his visits with a sense of anticipation that I struggled to justify. One afternoon, as rain drummed softly against the windows, he stopped by to help with a leaky faucet. I had been battling it for weeks, the steady drip a constant reminder of things left unresolved. He knelt under the sink, sleeves rolled up, hands deftly turning the wrench. I stood nearby, a towel in hand, my fingers tracing the worn fabric. The room was filled with the scent of dampness and metal and something else, a tension that sat between us, unacknowledged but palpable. "Can you hand me the pliers?" His voice pulled me from my thoughts. I knelt beside him, the cool tiles pressing against my knees. Our hands brushed as I passed the tool, a fleeting touch that lingered far longer than it should have. I caught my breath, my pulse a quiet thrum in my ears. He didn't pull away, his fingers curling over mine for a fraction of a second before he resumed his work. My skin tingled where he had touched me, a warmth spreading through me that I couldn't ignore. We finished the repair and sat on the kitchen floor, our backs against the cabinets. The rain had intensified, a gray curtain outside the window. He spoke of his plans, his uncertainty about his career, the weight of expectations. I listened, offering the kind of support that felt both maternal and dangerously close to something else. His voice was soft, his words like stones dropping into still water, creating ripples that reached me where I sat. "There are days when I feel like I'm just going through the motions," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Like nothing I do really matters." I knew that feeling well. It was the quiet erosion of hope, the slow settling of a life that no longer felt like your own. I wanted to tell him that it got better, that time would bring clarity and purpose, but the words felt like a lie. Instead, I reached out, my hand resting on his arm. He turned to me, his expression a mix of gratitude and something else, something I couldn't afford to name. Before I could withdraw, he leaned closer. His lips brushed mine, a tentative, questioning touch that held the weight of everything unspoken. My mind screamed at me to pull away, to set boundaries where none should have been crossed. But my body, starved for connection, betrayed me. I leaned into him, the kiss deepening, a quiet surrender to the moment. When we pulled apart, the room felt smaller, the air charged and unsteady. He whispered an apology, his voice thick with uncertainty. I managed a nod, words tangled in my throat. The reality of what had happened settled over me like a shroud. I had crossed a line, not just in my marriage but within myself. I had allowed a moment of weakness to reshape everything I thought I knew about who I was. He left shortly after, the door closing with a soft click that echoed through the empty house. I stood in the kitchen, my fingers pressed to my lips, the taste of regret already forming. I knew I had to find a way to make sense of what had happened, to rebuild the walls that had crumbled so easily. But deep down, beneath the layers of guilt and confusion, a small part of me whispered that this was only the beginning. The day after he left, the house felt unnaturally quiet. I went about my usual routines, folding laundry, wiping down counters, watering the houseplants, but my mind was elsewhere. His touch lingered in my memory, as if his hand had left a faint, invisible mark on my skin. Every few minutes I caught myself replaying the kiss, analyzing each second, questioning what it meant and what I should do next. I told myself it was a lapse in judgment, nothing more. A momentary weakness brought on by loneliness and vulnerability. Yet the thought of seeing him again stirred a conflicted anticipation inside me. I needed to understand why I'd let it happen, why I hadn't stopped it before it began. It was more than his attention or his charm. It was the way he made me feel visible, alive, even if only briefly. My husband, as usual, was distant even when he was home. His return from the business trip was marked by a few perfunctory questions about how things went while he was away. He didn't notice the change in me, didn't see the internal battle raging just beneath the surface. I wanted him to look at me, to really see me, but his focus remained elsewhere. On work emails, the upcoming project deadlines, the evening news. I started to wonder if he felt the distance too, or if it had simply become the norm for him. Was he content with this quiet, disconnected life we'd built? Or was he as lost as I was, unsure of how to bridge the growing chasm between us? The questions swirled in my mind, unanswered and persistent, pushing me closer to the edge of something I wasn't sure I could control. It was a week later when he showed up again. I heard the doorbell while I was tidying up in the living room, and a part of me knew it would be him before I even opened the door. He stood there, hands in his pockets, a tentative smile on his face. "Thought I'd drop by and see if you needed help with anything," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes holding something deeper, an unspoken acknowledgement of the last time we saw each other. I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. My heart raced as I tried to maintain a facade of normalcy. I told myself this was just a visit, nothing more. We could keep it professional, distant. But the moment we were alone in the kitchen, the tension returned, thick and heavy, hanging in the air between us. "I shouldn't have," he began, but I cut him off. "It was a mistake," I said quickly, trying to convince both of us. "It won't happen again." He nodded, but there was something in his expression that made me doubt his agreement. The conversation shifted to mundane topics, repairs around the house, his mother's upcoming birthday, but the undercurrent remained. Every glance, every accidental brush of his hand against mine, felt charged with unspoken emotion. I didn't know how to navigate this. On one hand, I wanted to distance myself, to push him away and salvage whatever was left of my marriage. On the other hand, I craved the connection, the sense of being seen that he brought into my life. I felt trapped in a web of my own making, every decision carrying a weight I wasn't prepared to bear. By the time he left, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. I stood at the window watching his car pull away, my reflection ghostly in the glass. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking a tightrope, the line between my present and what could be growing thinner by the day. For the rest of the evening, I avoided my husband's gaze, afraid he might see the guilt written on my face. The silence between us was louder than ever, a reminder of all the things we didn't say. I found myself longing for an escape, yet terrified of the consequences if I chose to take it. The next morning I awoke to a sense of inevitability. I knew I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. Something had to give, and I feared the moment when the fragile balance I'd been maintaining would finally collapse. The following weeks passed like a strange haze. My routines remained unchanged, but internally, I felt as if I were walking a line that grew thinner with each passing day. My husband's presence had become almost a background hum, steady, predictable, but somehow unreal. Even when we sat together at the dinner table, it was as though we occupied two separate worlds. He would ask how my day went, and I would answer with something vague, a half-truth that glossed over the thoughts I wasn't ready to confront. He never pressed further, perhaps because he was too distracted by his own concerns, or perhaps because he didn't know how. I tried to convince myself that everything would settle back into place, that this strange pull toward him, the young man who had stepped so easily into my life, was nothing more than a fleeting distraction. But no matter how hard I tried to suppress it, the memory of his touch, the sound of his voice, the way his eyes held mine kept resurfacing. Every time he stopped by, even under the guise of something mundane, a quick repair, a forgotten item from his mother's house, the air seemed to thicken. It was as if the room itself recognized the tension we couldn't speak aloud. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, I caught a glimpse of myself in the window's reflection. My hands moved automatically under the stream of water, scrubbing plates clean, but my mind was far away. I stared at my own face, noting the lines that had deepened over the years, the tiredness in my eyes. When had I stopped seeing myself as someone who mattered, as someone who deserved more than just quiet resignation? I dried my hands and turned away from the window, but the question lingered. A few days later he appeared again, this time with a box of tools and an offer to fix a broken step on the back porch. I hesitated, standing in the doorway as he looked up at me expectantly. I knew I should say no, that I should send him away and reclaim some semblance of normalcy. But instead I stepped aside and let him in, my voice betraying nothing of the turmoil inside me. We worked together in near silence, his focus on the repair and mine on keeping my thoughts in check. But the quiet was only on the surface. Beneath it, I could feel the weight of everything unspoken pressing against us. It wasn't until he finished and turned to face me that I realized how close we were standing. The tension was unbearable, a taut line stretched to its breaking point. "I can't keep coming here," he said, his voice low but firm. "Not like this." I didn't reply immediately. I couldn't. My mind raced with the implications of his words, with the acknowledgement that I had let things go too far. But as much as I wanted to agree to close this chapter before it caused any more damage, I found myself unable to speak. His eyes searched mine, and for a brief moment, I saw the same conflict reflected back at me. When I finally spoke, my voice was barely above a whisper. "I know." He nodded, his expression heavy with something I couldn't quite name. Without another word, he gathered his tools and left, leaving me standing there on the porch, the evening air cool against my skin. I stayed there long after he was gone, staring out at the yard, the sinking sun casting long shadows over the grass. The realization settled over me slowly, like the weight of a long-forgotten truth. I couldn't undo what had already happened, but I could choose where to go from here. I knew I needed to make a decision, to either rebuild the walls around my marriage or let them crumble entirely. The thought filled me with dread but also a strange sense of relief. I wasn't sure what would come next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it. I could no longer ignore the distance that had formed between us. My husband was still the same man I had married, steady, responsible, reliable, but something essential had been lost. It wasn't his fault entirely. Time and routine had crept into our relationship and dulled its edges, smoothing out the highs and lows until all that remained was a flat, predictable line. I knew he loved me in his way, but it was a love that didn't ask questions, didn't reach out, didn't see the storm brewing just beneath my surface. I told myself that I should be grateful. We had stability, security, a life that many would envy. And yet, as the days wore on, I found myself yearning for something more. Not just excitement but connection. A glance that lingered too long, a hand that reached for mine without hesitation, a voice that called me by name as if it truly meant something. I wanted to be more than a partner in a well-ordered life. I wanted to feel like a woman again, desired, valued, alive. It was a quiet afternoon when he returned, unannounced as always. The sound of his footsteps on the porch stirred something in me, a mix of anticipation and dread. I had resolved to keep my distance, to rebuild the lines I had allowed to blur. But the moment I opened the door and saw him standing there, his expression both tentative and determined, I felt the balance I had tried so hard to maintain begin to shift. "I thought you might need help with the garden," he said, holding up a pair of gloves and a small trowel. I hesitated, gripping the edge of the door. "I can manage." "Maybe, but it's more fun with two people," he replied, his smile light but his eyes serious. I should have turned him away. I should have reminded him and myself that his presence here only complicated things. But instead I stepped aside and let him in. We worked in the yard together, our conversation carefully neutral. We talked about the weather, the best way to prune rose bushes, the stubborn weeds that seemed to sprout overnight. Yet beneath it all, I could feel the unspoken words building, the tension mounting with each passing moment. At one point, as I reached for a watering can, his hand brushed against mine. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me. I glanced up at him, and for a brief second, I saw the conflict in his expression mirrored in my own. We both knew this couldn't continue, but neither of us was willing to stop. When we finished, we stood there side by side, surveying the neat rows of plants and freshly turned soil. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over everything, softening the sharp edges of reality. He turned to me, his voice low and hesitant. "I don't know what we're doing here," he said. "But I know it feels different. Right." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's not right. None of this is right. But it feels like it is," he said. His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of a truth neither of us wanted to face. I shook my head, stepping back. We can't keep doing this." He nodded slowly, as if accepting my words, even though I could see the doubt in his eyes. I just want to know if you feel the same." I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I turned and walked back into the house, closing the door behind me. I leaned against it, my heart pounding, my mind racing. I knew this was the breaking point. I could no longer pretend that everything was fine. I could no longer deny what I was feeling, what we were both feeling. But admitting it meant facing the consequences, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to take that step. As the evening settled in, I sat alone in the living room, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me. I stared at the empty chair where my husband usually sat, wondering if he even noticed the distance that had grown between us. I wondered if he would care. And I wondered what would happen if he ever found out the truth. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that there might not be a way back to the life I once knew. I had reached the breaking point, and now all that was left was to see where the pieces would fall. The following days felt both agonizingly slow and maddeningly fast. My routines carried on as usual. Breakfast made, laundry folded, errands run, but my mind refused to follow the steady rhythm. Each quiet moment was an opportunity for my thoughts to circle back to him. It wasn't just the kiss or the stolen glances. It was the way he looked at me, the way he seemed to see past the surface and into the parts of myself I had long since buried. But what haunted me most was the growing realization that I wanted him to see those parts. I wanted someone to look at me like that again. And yet, every time I felt that pull, I tried to remind myself of the life I had built. My marriage, while not perfect, had been the foundation of so much. We had weathered storms, built a home, shared years of memories. Throwing that away felt unthinkable, and the guilt that came with even considering it was suffocating. I told myself that I could fix this, that the distance between my husband and me could be bridged, if only I could find the right words, the right moment. But each attempt to reconnect fell flat. His attention remained elsewhere, on his projects, his phone, the flickering television screen. And my own half-hearted efforts seemed to go unnoticed. One evening, as we sat side by side on the couch, I turned to him, searching his face for any sign of the man I once knew. He glanced at me briefly, offered a small smile, then returned to the news broadcast. I wanted to reach out, to take his hand and ask him if he still loved me the way he used to. But the words caught in my throat and the moment passed. I started to wonder if I was the problem. Maybe I had changed, grown distant, become someone he couldn't connect with anymore. Perhaps the fault lay in me. My restlessness, my need for something more than the life we had built together. It was a terrifying thought, one that forced me to confront my own choices and the consequences they carried. I wasn't just a victim of circumstance. I had made decisions, taken steps that had led me to this moment. I couldn't deny that. And yet, despite my attempts to push him from my mind, he kept appearing. Not physically, he hadn't stopped by since that day in the garden, but in the corners of my thoughts, in the spaces where my husband's presence once filled. I found myself lingering over small details. The curve of his smile, the quiet strength in his hands, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It was as if I were replaying a song I couldn't stop humming, even when I knew I should let it go. One afternoon I decided to visit my best friend, his mother. It felt like the right thing to do, ground myself in the familiarity of our long-standing friendship, remind myself of the boundaries that should never have been crossed. We sat on her patio sipping tea and talking about everything except the one thing weighing on my mind. She mentioned her son briefly, how he'd been busy with work and hadn't been around as much. I nodded, my heart tightening at the mention of his name. "He's such a good boy," she said with a proud smile. "Always willing to help out, always so kind." I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it almost took my breath away. I wanted to tell her everything, to confess my confusion, my guilt, my longing. But the words stayed locked inside, tangled in my own fear and shame. Instead, I smiled and changed the subject, desperate to keep the conversation away from him. As I drove home that evening, I realized just how tangled my heart had become. I was caught between two worlds, one of comfort and history and another of possibility and desire. Neither felt fully right, yet neither could be easily abandoned. I told myself that I needed more time, more clarity, more strength. But deep down I knew the truth. I had reached a point where the choices I made would not only shape my future, but also the lives of those I cared about most. I thought of my husband, his steady presence, the life we had built together. I thought of him, his eyes searching mine, the connection that had sparked despite my best efforts to extinguish it. I felt like a tree caught in a storm, branches bending under the force of conflicting winds. I knew I couldn't stand in this place forever. Eventually, something would have to give. In the days that followed, I felt like a rope being pulled taut between two forces. On one side there was my life as I had always known it. The routines, the marriage, the stability I thought I could rely on. On the other side was the pull of something I couldn't define, a mixture of guilt, longing, and confusion. Each morning I told myself I would face it all more clearly, yet every evening I felt more entangled in the same cycle of doubt. The tension between my husband and me had become unbearable. I could see it in the way he avoided meeting my eyes, the way he rushed through our conversations as if eager to escape the discomfort. I'd thought I wanted him to notice something was wrong, to ask me what had changed. But now that the distance had become too obvious to ignore, I felt a different kind of fear. What would I even say if he asked? How could I explain the void I felt without betraying my heart's betrayal? Then one afternoon, without warning, my best friend arrived at my doorstep. Her presence caught me off guard, and for a moment I wondered if she somehow knew. She stepped inside, her face lined with an unfamiliar seriousness. She didn't sit down, didn't accept the tea I offered. Instead, she stood in the entryway and studied me, as if looking for something she couldn't quite name. "What's going on with you?" she asked finally, her voice low but direct. The question hung in the air and my mind raced for a response. I wanted to deflect, to tell her I was just tired or preoccupied. But her eyes pinned me in place. They were too searching, too knowing. My carefully constructed defenses felt suddenly fragile. "I don't know what you mean," I said, attempting to sound casual. "You've been different lately," she continued. "Distracted. Closed off. And my son, he hasn't been himself either. He won't say anything, but I can tell something's on his mind." I froze at her words. The mention of him brought a surge of heat to my face. My thoughts scrambled for something to say, anything that might steer the conversation away from the truth. But before I could answer, she sighed and shook her head. "Maybe I'm reading too much into it," she said, her tone softening. "But I'm worried about you. About both of you." Her words felt like a warning, a sign that the thin walls I'd built around myself were starting to crumble. I managed a weak smile, assured her that everything was fine, and saw her out. But as soon as the door closed behind her, I felt my composure unravel. She had been so close, too close, to uncovering the cracks in my carefully managed life. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, the weight of her words pressing down on me. She hadn't accused me of anything, hadn't even suggested she knew the truth. But the fact that she'd sensed something was enough to send me spiraling. I realized then how fragile this balance had become, how easily everything could fall apart. When he showed up again later that week, the sight of him at the door filled me with equal parts relief and dread. I let him in, my heart pounding, and we sat in the living room in uneasy silence. I wanted to tell him what had happened, to warn him that we needed to stop before it was too late. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself searching his face, hoping for a sign that he understood the risk we were taking. "Your mother was here," I said finally, my voice trembling slightly. He looked at me sharply. "What did she say?" "Nothing specific," I said, shaking my head. "She's just worried. She thinks something's wrong. With both of us." He leaned back, his brow furrowed. "She doesn't know anything. She's not blind," I said. "She sees more than we give her credit for." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want to hurt her. Or you." I looked down at my hands, unable to meet his eyes. "It's already too complicated." There was a long pause, the silence heavy between us. When I finally looked up, he was watching me, his expression unreadable. I wanted to say something that would make it all better, something that would erase the tension and confusion. But no words came. "I'll keep my distance," he said at last, his voice quiet but firm. "If that's what you want." I didn't answer. I couldn't. He waited for a moment, then stood and left. I sat there in the empty living room, the weight of his absence settling over me like a shroud. I told myself it was for the best, that this was the first step toward restoring the life I'd nearly lost. But as the hours passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. I wasn't sure if I could ever go back to the way things were. The week that followed felt interminable, as if time itself had slowed to force me to confront the consequences of my choices. I tried to immerse myself in daily tasks, hoping that distraction might erase the weight I carried. But the silence in my home had become deafening, and the spaces where I once felt comfortable now felt oppressive. My husband, though physically present, was more distant than ever. His eyes met mine less often, and his touch, already a rare occurrence, now felt almost clinical. Each interaction was a painful reminder of how far we had drifted. I wanted to talk to him, to tell him the truth about how I felt. Not about him, not about what had happened, but about myself. I felt like a stranger in my own skin, unable to reconcile who I had become with the woman I used to be. The easy intimacy we once shared seemed like a dream from another life. Now, even when we sat in the same room, the chasm between us felt insurmountable. Late one evening, as I sat at the dining table, a cup of tea cooling in my hands, I thought about how different things had become. Once, we would have spent the night talking, sharing stories about our day, making plans for the future. Now he was in the other room, the muffled sound of a sports commentator his only company. I stared at the tea, the steam long since dissipated, and tried to remember the last time I had felt truly connected to him. The memory was faint, almost out of reach. I found myself thinking again about the young man who had stirred something inside me, something I hadn't felt in years. I hated that I kept returning to him in my mind, hated that the memory of his touch, his smile, his presence had lodged itself so firmly in my thoughts. I had told him to stay away and he had listened. But his absence only made me more aware of the void he had momentarily filled. I wasn't proud of these feelings. They made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. But they were there, undeniable and persistent. One morning while folding laundry, I heard a knock at the door. My heart leapt and for a moment I thought it might be him. But when I opened it, I found my best friend standing there instead. Her expression was serious, her usual warmth replaced with something more measured. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes scanning the room as if searching for evidence of something unsaid. "I wanted to talk to you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I've been worried about you." I set down the laundry basket and gestured for her to sit, though I felt my chest tighten with dread. "Is everything all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked at me, her eyes piercing in a way that made me feel exposed. "I don't know," she admitted. "I just feel like something's off. Between him. He hasn't been himself lately. And you've been distant." Her words hit me like a blow. I opened my mouth to respond, but no sound came out. She continued, her tone softer now. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I just want to understand. Are you okay?" I nodded quickly, my throat tight. "I'm fine. Really. I've just been distracted. There's been a lot on my mind." Her gaze lingered on me, and for a moment I thought she might press further. But then she sighed and leaned back in her chair. "If you ever need to talk, I'm here. You know that, right?" I nodded again, murmuring my thanks, and she left soon after. But her visit left me shaken. She was too perceptive, too attuned to the changes I had tried so hard to hide. She could see something was wrong. How long before others did too? How long before my husband noticed? Or perhaps he already had and he was simply waiting for me to come clean. The days blurred together, each one feeling heavier than the last. I thought about reaching out to my husband, trying once more to bridge the gap. But every time I considered it, a wave of doubt stopped me. What if it was too late? What if I had already done too much damage, even if he didn't yet know the full extent of it? I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spinning in circles. I had tried to keep everything under control, to manage my feelings, to salvage what was left of my life. But it was becoming clear that I couldn't keep the pieces from falling apart. I had reached the edge of something, and all I could do now was wait for the inevitable fall. The night after my friend's visit, I hardly slept. Instead, I lay in bed, staring at the shifting patterns of light on the ceiling as passing cars sent faint streaks through the blinds. My husband slept beside me, his breathing deep and steady, unaware of the turmoil swirling just inches away. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, worried, searching, as though she already knew what I was too afraid to admit aloud. I told myself that I'd managed to reassure her, that her concerns would fade with time, but deep down I knew better. She knew something wasn't right. Maybe she didn't have the full picture yet, but she was too perceptive, too close, not to sense the cracks in my carefully maintained facade. By morning I felt like a hollow shell. I made coffee, poured a cup for my husband and set it on the counter where he always picked it up. He gave me a distracted smile, one of those brief, surface-level gestures that had come to define our interactions. I wanted to reach for him, to say something that would bridge the distance between us, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I busied myself in the kitchen, wiping down the countertops that were already spotless. Anything to keep my hands moving so I wouldn't have to think too much. Later that day, as I sat at my desk trying to focus on a work project, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a name that made my stomach twist into knots. My friend. I stared at it, the ringtone echoing in the room, but I didn't answer. I couldn't. Instead, I let it go to voicemail and sank deeper into my chair, the weight of everything pressing down on me. She was reaching out again and I couldn't bring myself to face her. Not yet. Not while I still didn't know what I was going to say or do. As the hours ticked by, my unease grew. I found myself pacing the living room, the silence of the house only amplifying my thoughts. When my husband returned that evening, I studied him carefully, looking for any sign that he might suspect something. But he seemed as he always did, focused on his phone, talking about an upcoming deadline, barely noticing me. It should have been a relief, but instead it made me feel even more invisible. I began to think about leaving. Not permanently, just for a few days. A trip to clear my head, to put some space between me and all the tangled emotions I could no longer manage. Maybe if I stepped away, even briefly, I'd be able to see things more clearly. I could think about what I truly wanted, what I needed to do next. But the idea felt like both an escape and a betrayal, and I couldn't bring myself to voice it even to myself. That night, as I lay in bed once again unable to sleep, I thought about the young man. I tried to remember his face clearly, the details of his voice, the exact shade of his eyes. It was strange how those moments of connection, so fleeting, so rare, had managed to linger in my mind, taking up more space than I wanted to admit. I told myself I was thinking about him because I was lonely, because I felt disconnected from my husband. It wasn't about him, not really. He was just the catalyst, the spark that had brought to the surface all the things I tried to ignore. But even as I rationalized it, I couldn't deny the pull he still had over me, no matter how much I tried to suppress it. The next day, I finally gathered the courage to return my friend's call. My hand shook as I pressed the phone to my ear, and when she answered, her voice was warm but tinged with the same concern I'd heard the last time we spoke. "I'm sorry I missed your call," I said quickly. "Things have been busy." "It's okay," she said, her tone gentle. "I just wanted to check in. I feel like I haven't seen you much lately." I tried to keep my voice steady, tried to sound casual. "Yeah, things have been a bit hectic." There was a pause and then she said, "You know, I'm always here if you need to talk. About anything." Her words felt like an invitation and a challenge all at once. My heart raced as I considered what she might already know, what she might have pieced together from the fragments I'd tried so hard to keep hidden. But I couldn't bring myself to say anything more. Instead, I thanked her and promised to catch up soon, hoping it would be enough to keep her at a distance for just a little while longer. When I hung up, I realized that my hands were trembling. The conversation had been brief, almost trivial, but it left me feeling exposed. She was watching, waiting, and I knew that the more I hesitated, the closer she might come to finding out the truth. The thought was both terrifying and strangely liberating. I couldn't keep this up forever. Sooner or later, the facade would crack and everything I'd tried to hold together would come spilling out. For the first time, I wondered what might happen if I let it.